People seldom notice the most important event in a room. It happens quietly, without spectacle. A curtain stirs, a chair shifts half an inch, and something essential has moved. Yet everyone carries on as though nothing has changed. Something similar unfolded in the global economy. A shift so discreet it left no visible trace, and yet it rearranged the balance of nations. Most people lived through its consequences without ever recognizing the moment it began. It started with a decision made decades ago by men who realized the world could be steered with obligations more effectively than with gold. A decision that placed the US dollar at the center of a structure so intricate that entire generations have moved through it without noticing the walls. That structure has a name, the petrodollar. From a distance it looks straightforward, but once you pry at its edges, motives sharpen, consequences deepen, and the design reveals itself as far more deliberate than history textbooks ever admit. And like any good mystery, it begins with a question that should trouble you more than it does. How did one currency come to govern the world, and why does its strength seem to place such weight upon the people who depend on it? Before we trace the origins, you need to see the landscape as it stands today. The world runs on dollars, plainly, mechanically, and without exception. A shipment of grain from Argentina to Egypt moves under a dollar contract. A factory in India buying machinery from Germany closes the deal in dollars. Across continents, central banks store their national security in the form of US dollar reserves. And oil, the substance every modern economy depends on, flows only through dollar-denominated channels. A nation may print its own currency, set its own policies, even harbor its own ambitions. But the moment it needs to buy energy, defend its exchange rate, service foreign debt, or stabilize its banking system, it reaches for the same currency every time. When markets seize, investors flee into dollars. When governments face turmoil, they hoard dollars to brace their collapsing currencies. When droughts, shortages, or wars strike, survival often hinges not on a country's own money, but on access to US dollars. The dependency is absolute. No nation, large or small, stands outside it. Once you recognize that, the world begins to resemble a locked room more than an open marketplace. Every country draws from the same supply of oxygen. Some breathe freely, others struggle for air. This is the environment you already live in, whether or not anyone ever explained the machinery behind it. The petrodollar didn't simply influence global economics, it arranged them. It set the terms of trade, the boundaries of sovereignty, and the hierarchy of nations long before any of us understood the rules. And only after grasping the scale of this dependency can we return to the moment when it was engineered, a moment when the architecture was designed with remarkable precision and whose consequences still shape your daily life. The unraveling began long before anyone admitted it. By the late 1960s, the United States had quietly issued more dollars than it had gold to redeem, but no one dared to say the system was failing. You could feel it in the background, a subtle imbalance discussed only in back rooms and diplomatic cables, like a structure groaning before it cracks. For years, the discrepancy lived as a rumor. Then foreign governments started asking questions, polite at first, then sharper. France made the boldest move. It sent a naval vessel to New York with a request that was entirely legal and profoundly destabilizing: convert French dollars into gold and load the bars onto the ship. Other countries prepared to do the same, and they weren't bluffing. If even a few nations followed through, the U.S. gold supply would evaporate. If the U.S. refused, the dollar's credibility would vanish instead. It was a trap with no dignified escape. By the summer of 1971, Nixon understood that the world was closing in. Advisors warned him that once the first domino fell, the whole monetary system would collapse. Markets sensed the tension. Intelligence reports described foreign governments quietly coordinating their next moves. The pressure was absolute. On August 15th, Nixon went on national television and performed the financial equivalent of cutting a hostage loose from its restraints by severing the rope entirely. He suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold permanently. No consultations, no warnings, no votes. The anchor that had held the global economy together for a generation vanished in a single announcement. For a moment, the world froze. Then panic set in. Currencies broke from their fixed exchange rates. Trading desks scrambled. Governments held emergency meetings. A reserve currency with no tangible backing had never existed in modern history, and no one knew what would replace the old order. The dollar was still powerful, but its foundation had been kicked out from under it. The U.S. needed a new pillar, something universal, indispensable, and beyond the reach of speculative attacks. That search led to the Persian Gulf. In 1974, under a climate of geopolitical tension and skyrocketing oil prices, American diplomats approached Saudi Arabia with an arrangement that would quietly determine the fate of the global economy. The kingdom would sell its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars, every transaction, every barrel, every contract. In return, the United States would guarantee military protection, supply advanced weaponry, and support Saudi interests on the world stage. And there was one more layer, whispered rather than announced. Saudi oil revenue would cycle back into U.S. financial markets, reinforcing the very system it relied on. The Saudis agreed, OPEC followed, and in that moment, the dollar found a new anchor, one far more potent than gold. Oil became the backbone of the monetary world, and because every country needed oil, every country needed dollars, whether they trusted the U.S. or feared it. Demand was no longer a matter of confidence. It was survival. The petrodollar wasn't just a policy decision. It was a restructuring of global power, engineered in the shadows of crisis and sealed with a commodity no nation could live without. From that point forward, the dollar was more than a currency. It became the air the global economy breathed. And like air, its importance was invisible until something went wrong. Once the dollar was tied to oil, the world settled into a new rhythm, quiet, technical, and unmistakably binding. It didn't unfold through treaties or declarations. It appeared in balance sheets, interest rates, and the discreet urgency with which nations tried to secure their place inside a system no one could refuse. To see its mechanism clearly, you have to accept one unsettling truth. Every dollar in existence begins as someone's debt. When the U.S. government issues treasury bonds, it is borrowing from investors and promising repayment. Those promises become the bedrock of global finance, so trusted and so liquid that banks treat them almost as cash. Government debt becomes the world's collateral. When banks extend loans, they don't distribute dollars sitting idle in a vault. They create new dollars the moment a signature is placed on a loan agreement. The loan becomes the asset, the deposit becomes the money, the obligation becomes the reason that money exists. Two different pathways, one identical outcome. Money enters the world paired with a liability. Dollar creation and debt creation move together like twins that cannot be separated. But the real tension begins beyond America's borders. Once oil required dollars, every nation needed dollars simply to keep its economy alive. Yet most cannot create U.S. currency. They must earn it through exports, attract it through investment, or borrow it from global markets. And when those channels fail, as they often do, they turn to dollar-denominated debt. A country short on energy borrows in dollars. A banking system under stress bolsters itself with dollar reserves. A government watching its currency slide accepts IMF loans tied to dollar conditions. Crisis after crisis pushes nations deeper into obligations priced in a currency they do not control. And as global demand rises, the dollar strengthens. A stronger dollar makes existing debts heavier, because local currencies now buy fewer dollars than before. What once seemed manageable turns predatory. So governments borrow again, this time simply to stay upright. And this is where the loop reveals itself. Dollar scarcity drives borrowing. Borrowing strengthens the dollar. A stronger dollar sharpens the weight of old debts. Heavier debts force countries to seek even more dollars. More demand triggers more dollar creation. New treasuries, new loans, new obligations circulating across the planet. A system originally designed to stabilize markets ends up using debt as its oxygen. And because the dollar sits at the center, the US becomes the world's supplier of that oxygen created through the expansion of its own liabilities. This is why global debt grows faster than global GDP, why countries in crisis run back to the dollar even when it harms them, why the United States can carry deficits that would shatter another nation, why a Federal Reserve rate hike can convulse economies thousands of miles away. Once you see this architecture, the contradictions of modern life stop feeling random. You recognize the pattern. Debt expands because the system requires it. The dollar strengthens because demand is relentless. Crises deepen because each attempted escape folds nations further inside the structure. And the pressure you feel in rent, in borrowing costs, in the slow erosion of purchasing power is not a flaw in this design. It is one of its intended outcomes. Once the world tied itself to the dollar, pressure began to travel in unexpected ways. A disturbance in one region surfaced somewhere entirely different, often thousands of miles away, in places that had no hand in causing it. The system behaved less like an open marketplace and more like a chain of sealed chambers, each one transmitting stress to the next. When the Federal Reserve tightened policy to protect the dollar at home, currency markets abroad trembled. Nations with fragile balance sheets watched their exchange rates slide faster than they could respond. Import costs rose, energy prices spiked, dollar-denominated debts grew heavier as local currencies weakened. Inflation appeared in countries that had done nothing to trigger it. They woke to shortages, soaring food prices, and street-level unrest, not because of domestic mistakes, but because the dollar had shifted its weight. And once those countries faltered, the damage flowed back into global markets in the form of collapsing bonds, distressed banks, and sudden capital flight. Investors, sensing danger, retreated into dollars for safety. The dollar strengthened again, and the cycle tightened its grip on everyone caught inside it. Crisis abroad became stability at the dollar's center. Stability at the center created fragility everywhere else. You could see the pattern clearly. A spike in U.S. interest rates drained capital from emerging markets. Those markets responded with austerity or emergency borrowing. Borrowing deepened their dependence on dollar reserves. Dependence magnified their vulnerability to the next shift in U.S. policy. And the next shift always came because the system requires constant recalibration to keep the center steady. Ordinary people felt the consequences long before their governments did. Rent rose, groceries grew more expensive, savings lost value with every currency swing. Paychecks stretched less and less each year, even when nothing about daily life had changed. A woman in Cairo paying more for bread had no idea her struggle began with a rate decision in Washington. A family in Buenos Aires watching their currency crumble didn't know they were living at the fault line of a system designed to protect the dollar before anything else. And in the United States itself, the pressure appeared in subtler forms: rising borrowing costs, shrinking affordability, and a widening gap between what life demands and what income delivers. Once you see the feedback loop, the world looks coordinated in a way no official ever acknowledges. Every shock reinforces the dollar, and every reinforcement creates another shock elsewhere. And as long as the system remains arranged this way, the cost of stability will always be paid, quietly, consistently, by the people least equipped to bear it. For most people, the petrodollar system is invisible. It doesn't announce itself when it shapes a country's interest rates, or when it forces a government to choose between defending its currency and funding its schools. It offers no introduction when it alters the price of food, housing, or medicine. The pressure arrives quietly, disguised as everyday life. Inflation becomes a slow rearranging of priorities: what a family stops buying first, what it postpones next, what it gradually learns to live without. Each decision feels personal, yet the cause sits far beyond the household budget, rippling outward from the structure that binds global markets together. The dollar's strength is often celebrated as national resilience, but strength in the currency does not guarantee strength in the society that uses it. A rising dollar can be a symptom of global fragility, the world rushing into the safest room in the house, even when that room is already crowded. And in that crowded room, ordinary people feel the squeeze first. This is the human cost of a system that steadies the world by distributing instability into the quiet corners of daily life. It doesn't assign villains or victims. It simply arranges incentives so that pressure never disappears. It only shifts its direction. When people talk about the dollar, they call it a currency. When governments plan around it, they treat it as a resource. But what it truly represents is a system that fused power, obligation, and survival so tightly that the world can't pull them apart without risking collapse. The petrodollar built a new world, one held together by debt, disciplined by crisis, and stabilized through dependence. And the great irony is this: the stronger the system became, the more fragile everyone inside it felt. That is the quiet symmetry of the modern economy, a structure that cannot be unwound, only endured. A loop that expands with every crisis and resets with every gasp for stability. In every good mystery, the final truth is usually hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice what was there all along. So we return to the question that began this story. How did one currency come to govern the world? And why does its strength weigh so heavily on the people who depend on it? The answer is disturbingly simple. The dollar became powerful the moment the world arranged itself around it, and the weight you feel is a sign that the system was working exactly as designed. A currency that anchors every nation must absorb every shock. A currency that stabilizes global trade must carry global risk. A currency that becomes the world's refuge does so by drawing strain from everywhere else. The dollar governs because the world built no other doorway. Its strength feels heavy because you are standing on the same floor that holds everyone up. If this helped you see the architecture more clearly, subscribe. The story of money is never simple, and we're only at the beginning.